Agave Utahensis is under threat, not only from climate change, which is putting a lot of plant and animal species in danger, but also from over-collection, wild collection, and monoculturing. So that's what we're talking about in this video. What are the dangers of over-collection, wild collection, poaching, and monoculture to Agave Utahensis, and what we can do to protect this plant? So we've talked on this channel a few times before about various issues surrounding poaching and wild collection of Agave Utahensis. I've talked about the fact that not all wild collection is poaching, because poaching is a crime that requires that a plant has been illegally dug up from the wild, and there are absolutely examples of Agave Utahensis wild collection operations that are doing so legally. And we've also talked about the fact that while they may be legal, they may not be ethical, and they may be in fact unsustainable. Talked about that both in a video with just me, and then I've also talked about that when I interviewed Kelly Griffin. Now, we've also talked about on this video how to tell a wild collected plant apart from a seed grown plant. So if you're buying Agave Utahensis, say online, you can figure out which one you're buying, and you can make sure that you're only buying seed grown plants. But one thing that I've only sort of touched on a little bit is why wild collection or poaching, where it's illegal, is actually bad for Agave Utahensis and for the ecosystem that it lives in. And so to do that, I think there are two main points that we have to discuss, two main impacts that poaching or wild collection can have on Agave Utahensis and the surrounding ecosystem. And those 2 points are just a net reduction in overall population sizes, and then the second one is a loss of genetic diversity. But to discuss those two impacts, those two negative impacts, we should first understand what kinds of wild harvesting and potentially even poaching in some cases is actually happening out in the real world with Agave Utahensis. So while I have not yet found actual hard evidence of poaching, that is, of plants taken from the wild in areas where that would be illegal, a lot of Agave Utahensis grows on protected land, at the federal or state level, and digging up plants there would definitely be illegal. But Agave Utahensis does also grow on a lot of private land where it could be legally, again, perhaps not ethically or sustainably collected, but legally collected. And so I haven't found any evidence of large-scale poaching, although I go out and I look as much as I possibly can, and I document the few examples that I have found where it does look like plants have been removed from the ground. But most of what I do know for a fact actually happens is large-scale legal wild collection. Again, it may be unethical, it may be unsustainable. And so when we're talking about large-scale wild harvesting, what does that actually look like in practice? So basically, that would be industrial size, commercial size collection, digging up of plants from large contiguous areas. There would be, say, a plot of land in a certain area, and for whatever reason, the owner of that land wants to remove the agave plants there, either to clear the land to do some other kind of development or mining or build a house, or they just want to sell the plants on the market because they know that Agave Utahensis, particularly old and mature ones, can go for a pretty good price online, particularly when you export them to Asia. And so what will happen in those cases is somebody will come in and remove all or close to all of the mature individuals in that given area, in that plot of land, right? To do so, they've generally got to chop up all the roots. And we talked about this in the video about how to identify a wild collected Agave Utahensis plant, but basically, Agave Utahensis has a really fibrous root system that in the wild will spread out pretty far. And in order to be able to dig up the plants, you kind of got to chop up all the roots and then pull the plant out of the ground. So a lot of wild collected plants will have their roots really damaged and excessively pruned. And then once the plants have been had their roots all chopped up and then been pulled out of the wild from that contiguous area, from that one plot of land, then they're generally going to be put in the lowest cost, the cheapest growing media possible. And Kelly Griffin, when I interviewed him, described this a lot of times as river sand. As you may know from my soil mix video, you can get pretty in-depth about the ingredients that you're putting in the proper soil mix to give Agave Utahensis really the best possible growing medium. And some of those ingredients, depending on where you are and how much of it you're using, like crushed limestone, for instance, can actually get pretty expensive. And so when an operation is digging up a whole lot of wild Agave Utahensis plants, they're going to need to fill up a whole bunch of trade 1 gallon size pots. That's typically what they're using, with a lot of soil. And if they're doing this to maximize profits, they're going to use the cheapest media, the cheapest soil, the cheapest dirt they can find. And in a lot of cases, you know, if they have some sort of land that's usually on the valley floor, because land up in the mountains is really expensive and really limited. And so they're just digging up the sand, essentially, that makes up the valley floor and using that. And that is not the proper media for Agave Utahensis at any stage of its life, but particularly, it's not the right soil for Agave Utahensis when it needs to regrow roots, because sand is super duper compact. That really fibrous root system is not going to be able to expand like it would through a more granular soil mixture, like the one I recommend using in my soil mix video. And then those plants, when they're finally shipped off to wherever, be that domestically or in the case of a lot of these plants internationally, they're going to be transported, they're going to be shipped, they're going to be sold to a place that may not be what they're adapted to. All right, I always talk about how Agave Utahensis is the most cold hardy plant, and you can grow it inside as a house plant, and that's all true, particularly when we're talking about seed grown plants, like the seed grown plants that I grow, which, by the way, if you're interested in buying any actually seed grown Agave Utahensis plants that are sustainably and ethically grown by myself, you can do that on my website at mojave.lv. But the plants that I grow them almost entirely indoors, under, you know, artificial lighting with the right amount of water and nutrients and soil mix, and so they're adapted to those conditions. Plants that have spent decades in the wild are adapted to those conditions, which are very different than conditions in most of Asia, where a lot of the plants in the international market are going, and are very, very different than, you know, a greenhouse, you know, somebody's back, you know, deck or whatever, or even indoors if folks are growing them indoors. And so in a lot of cases, the plants that have spent decades, you know, many decades, several decades, growing outdoors under a ton of light, you know, with not very much moisture, are then going to be dug up, have their roots all chopped up, put into a really sandy mixture, at least for some portion of their life, until they're sold. Hopefully the person that buys them maybe puts them into a better soil mix, but they're probably not going to be in an environment where they're adapted to it. So what ends up happening is that a lot of these plants will die, right? They will die. Not all of them. It is possible to grow one of these, and if you know what you're doing, you can save one of these wild collected plants, but many of these wild collected plants by these large scale wild harvesting operations are going to die. And so companies that are doing this sort of wild collection, and many of them, again, are shipping them overseas, are decreasing the overall number of Agave Utahensis that exist in the world, period. And we're going to get a little bit more into the math on that in a second. But the other thing you need to think about when you're thinking about these companies is that if these companies profit from digging these plants up or selling plants that have been dug up, they are then incentivized to dig up more plants of either Agave Utahensis or some other variety. And that's where we can come in as consumers, you know, and then I talked about this in my, you know, how to tell a wild harvested versus a seed grown plant. If you are buying wild collected plants, you are funding the organizations that are digging these plants up if it's unsustainable and unethical, even if it may be legal, and you are incentivizing them to do more of this in the future. So if you care about Agave Utahensis, I would strongly urge, unless you really, really know your sources and where the plants are coming from, and that's very difficult to do, to only buy seed-grown plants. So now that we understand what the most likely, what generally wild collection looks like on a large scale, let's talk about the damages that can cause, the harm that can cause to Agave Utahensis and its surrounding ecosystem. So when it comes to plants or animals that are threatened or endangered or extinct, a lot of folks use those words sort of willy-nilly, but they actually have a pretty well-defined set of criteria that's defined by an organization called the IUCN. Now, the IUCN was founded in 1948 and stands for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And their mission is basically to ensure that any use of natural resources, and it's plants, animals, is equitable and ecologically sustainable. And so that's the organization. They do a lot of really awesome work, but that's generally the organization that will define for most other bodies that then try to regulate the use of natural resources, whether or not a specific species or, you know, plant family or, you know, genus is endangered, is extinct, is vulnerable. And they do this by categorization. And so we all know what extinct means. That means there's none left in the wild, or none that we know about in the wild. And then there's well, that's extinct. There's none left at all in the entire world. And then there's extinct in the wild, right? Which is basically there are some still in cultivation, some individuals of a given species in cultivation, but there are none, at least none that we know about, that exist in the wild. But there are three categories when we're talking about Agave Utahensis that are the most relevant. And those are critically endangered, endangered, and then vulnerable. And that's from the most severe to the least severe, although even vulnerable plants are severely threatened by a number of things. And amongst the criteria, I'm not going to, the criteria is mathematical. There are numbers and percentages and rates and all this stuff assigned to each of these categories that are really specific. And I'm not going to get into all of them specifically, except for to kind of give you an idea of the ranges we're talking about here, right? So one of the most important set of criteria is population size and reduction rates, right? So when you're talking about critically endangered plants, if there are less than 50 plants known, or 50 individuals known, and when we talk about plants or individuals, in this case we're talking about mature individuals, if there are less than 50 plants known, then that is considered to be critically endangered. But if there are less than 250 plants or mature individuals known, and there has been a recorded 25% reduction over the course of 10 years or 3 generations, whichever is longer, which with Agave Utahensis it's 3 generations is longer. If there's been more than a 25% reduction in population size and there's only 250 plants left, then that plant is considered critically endangered. And again, to give you some context, that means that if a plant is critically endangered, it only needs to have 63 individuals removed or die off within 3 generations. And the scale of Agave Utahensis wild collection that we're talking about is far, far, far above 63 plants. There are probably 63 wild collected plants, or more than 63 wild collected plants, sold online every month. And we're only talking about a requirement to be critically endangered for 63 wild plants to be taken out of population over the course of 10 years or 3 generations. With the 3 generations in the case of Agave Utahensis could be 60 or 50 years, right? The next layer down is just endangered, not critically endangered, but endangered. And that's plants, or, it could be animals, but in this case, obviously we're talking about plants, that have fewer than 250 mature individuals known, or less than 2,500 individuals known with a 20% population reduction. And again, that's 500 plants. That's what 20% of 2,500 is 500 plants over 5 years or 2 generations, which in the case of Agave Utahensis, 2 generations is something like 25 years. So again, 500 plants is not a lot of plants to be taken out of the wild when we're talking about the scale of Agave Utahensis wild harvesting that's happening. The next layer down is vulnerable, and plants are considered vulnerable by the IUCN if there are less than 1,000 mature individuals known, or there's less than 10,000 individuals known, but there's been a 10% population reduction over 10 years or 3 generations, and that boils down to about 1,000 plants. I would wager a guess that over the last 2-3 years-ish, the number of Agave Utahensis plants that I've seen sold in the market, online, domestically, and internationally, is far in excess of 1,000 plants, right? But we don't know exactly how many Agave Utahensis overall of the entire species, or of Nevadensis or Eborospina even exist. And so that's where my project Eborospina comes in, and I've talked about that in previous videos, and you can go check that out if you want to know more about my plan to try to create some of these numbers, to try to produce some of these numbers so that we can understand the size of Agave Utahensis, specifically Eborospina populations. Now, beyond just population size, the IUCN looks at basically 4 other criteria to determine the status of a plant, how threatened it is, of a plant or animal, but again, we're talking about plants here. The other one is range reduction, and very similarly, very closely related to range reduction is habitat fragmentation and single location plants, right? So that means basically if you have a plant or an animal that used to have a very large range, and because of climate change, human, impacts, either poaching or, wild overcollection or land development, land use, that habitat has shrunk dramatically, that can be a criteria to listing in an IUCN threatened category. Or not only if that habitat has been shrunk dramatically, but if it's been fragmented. If it used to be one big contiguous area, but now, you know, these plants only exist, and particularly when we're talking about plants, this is a very sensitive issue, when those plants are now relegated to very fragmented small places. When we're talking about Agave utahensis, because it grows up in those sky islands, right? It grows up high at altitude at a very specific band of elevation because it can't grow on the hot desert floors. The natural population of Agave utahensis is already fairly fragmented. You know, it has a lot of habitat fragmentation happening, and with climate change, we're going to see even more habitat fragmentation as as temperatures increase. The elevation at which Agave utahensis can exist will go up, which will further fragment populations. And we'll talk about that more in a second. And then if a plant or animal only exists at a single location, that is also a criteria used to determine its threatened status, because obviously if a plant only occurs in a single area, it's very, very vulnerable. And then there are statistical predictions of extinction. Basically, you know, if you take an estimation of the total population size, an estimation of the total population decrease, and within 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever that time frame is, that math works out that there's not going to be any of these plants left. That again is also another criteria. So that is the way that the IUCN determines whether or not plants are threatened. And when we're talking about Agave utahensis, you know, there's a few of those that should raise some red flags. Folks who know about Agave utahensis, nerds like myself about it, who care about it. One is that habitat fragmentation, right? The Agave utahensis population is already very, very fragmented just naturally, right? There are, as I talked about with Kelly Griffin, there are very specific individual areas, particularly for Iborospina and Nevadensis, where Agave utahensis grows, and there's not a lot of contact between these populations because of those sky islands. The other issue with Agave utahensis that should raise some red flags when we're talking about it here is single or low number of locations. Particularly when we're talking about Agave utahensis Iborospina, there are only a handful, maybe less than 10, documented places that Agave utahensis occurs in. So if we have much more wild collection of these places, then that number is very easy to decrease. That is a very vulnerably low number of individual populations. And then the other red flag issue when we look at IUCN's criteria for vulnerability for Agave utahensis is those population reduction rates. Now, while the vast majority of plants that I see, wild collected Agave utahensis plants that I see being sold online, are of the Nevadensis or even just the regular degular variety, the scale is pretty large, right? I'm thinking of one, I'm not going to name them, but I'm thinking of one particular organization that does not actually dig the plants up themselves from the wild, but gets them from another source that is local here to Las Vegas. But they export a ton of plants internationally. They sell a bunch of plants online. If you've Googled Agave utahensis and tried to buy a mature plant, you've almost certainly come across their website or one of their outlets. And I've actually sort of shown pictures of their stuff because they lie. They're lying and they're saying their plants are Iborospina, and they're absolutely not Iborospina. And so when we're talking about Agave utahensis and those threats, Iborospina is, I believe, the most vulnerable of all the varieties, mostly because it's the one that's the most desired by the market and because it's the one that's got the fewest number of documented locations. But most of the plants being sold, mature, wild collected plants being sold on the internet are not Iborospina, even though those unscrupulous sellers of wild collected, wild harvested plants dug up from the wild are lying to you. And I made a whole video about, you're being lied to and how to tell Iborospina from the other varieties of Agave utahensis. But the scale is enormous. And so that's the first thing that we need to think about with Agave utahensis and why wild collection of Agave utahensis is bad. Because simply the scale of it that's happening is so large and the populations are already fragmented and there are already so few of those populations that just overall population sizes are fairly vulnerable to that pressure. Right, there just aren't that many Agave utahensis plants. Again, as I've said before, Project Iborospina is something that I've done, a plan that I have to go out and actually survey Agave utahensis Iborospina plants to figure out how many there are out in the wild so that we can start to do some of this math and potentially get it listed as in one of these categories. But there is no doubt that those 3 red flag criteria that I pointed out, plus the size of the market online, mean that the population sizes of Agave Utahensis are in danger of wild collection. And so the bottom line here is that whether or not a wild collection operation is legal, whether or not you consider it ethical, the bottom line is that those organizations are reducing both the number of Agave Utahensis plants in the wild, and that's obvious because they're digging them up, but they're also reducing the overall, both in the wild and cultivated, the overall sum of all the Agave Utahensis plants in the wild, because they are damaging the roots, they are sticking them in a soil that they're not supposed to be in, and then they're shipping them off to plants, to areas that the plants are not adapted for. So a large percentage of the Agave Utahensis plants that are being wild collected are dying, and so these organizations that are selling you wild collected plants are lowering the overall number of agave. They are not doing conservation by the numbers. They're not, preserving the number of Agave Utahensis that exist. They are contributing to the decline of Agave Utahensis that exist overall in the world, both in the wild and overall, because most of these plants are going to die. And so the second part of this, I said, there's 2 parts to the damage that is done by wild collection, particularly over wild collection of Agave Utahensis from the wild, is the loss of genetic diversity. And so when we talk about loss of genetic diversity, the easiest example to give is this story of targeted wild collection. And in most cases, this would actually be poaching, because when we're talking about plants that would be targeted for wild collection, generally we're talking about Ebora plants and exceptional individuals. That is, plants that have traits, very, very long spines, merged spines, things like that, that make them more desirable than the average Agave Utahensis, right? People want to generally buy Agave Utahensis Ebora more than they just want to buy regular Utahensis, because it's the Ebora or the merged spine plants that look super cool sitting on their balcony or on a shelf in their house. And so when we're talking about targeted wild collection, again, in a lot of cases that would be poaching, because those exceptional individuals are growing on protected land where digging them up would in fact be a crime. One really specific example of that, and I actually have 2 examples, but one really specific example of that is something called merged hill, right? I haven't been to this area yet, but I've been told, and if you search online for Agave Utahensis, one of the places in habitat that you're going to see come up in content a decent amount is this place called merged hill. And basically what it is one given hill in Agave Utahensis habitat where nearly every plant, some years ago, nearly every plant in that habitat on that hill had merged spines. And I've shown pictures of merged spines before. It's basically when the terminal spine is really thick and it merges into the teeth of the spines, the spines of the plant that occur on the margins of the leaf when it merges into that. And that's a really desirable trait in the marketplace. Merged spine plants can be sold for a lot of money online, particularly again into the Asian markets. And so some years ago, this one particular area, which has been dubbed Merged Hill by folks who knew about it, almost every plant there had merged spines. Now it reportedly, and again, I haven't been there and I wasn't there years ago, so I can't actually confirm personally, but I've heard the story from several sources that when you go visit this merged hill area now, many of those plants do not have that merged spine characteristic anymore. In fact, most of the plants, the vast majority of the plants in that area, in fact, now no longer have those merged spines. And so that's a result, the claim goes, and I can't confirm this personally, but the claim goes that that's a result of targeted poaching, because this is on protected land, so it would be poaching here, not just legal wild collection, but that's the result of targeted poaching. And so the genetics for that merged spine have been removed from that environment in large numbers, which results in a loss of genetic diversity. Now subsequent generations of plants in that area are going to be less likely to have that merged spine trait, right? And so that's one example of a decline in genetic diversity. A much more specific example of that is a plant that I've shown on this channel before that I have visited personally that does also have merged spines. It's not on Merged Hill, but it does have merged spines, and it's a very well-known plant. I often talk about the fact that it's like an internet celebrity. It's one of the most well-known Agave Utahensis Ebora plants online. You see it on YouTube, you see it on Instagram quite a bit, and some folks in the know have dubbed it the GOAT plant, the greatest of all time plant. I've been told, I've only visited recently within the last year, so I didn't see this previously, but I've been told that that plant previously had at least 2 offshoots growing from it that over the years were stolen, were poached. Again, that's on protected federal land. Removing those plants would absolutely be poaching. Removing anything about those plants would absolutely be poaching because they're on protected federal land, particularly even the offsets that, again, would be poaching. And so now that plant is just a single solitary individual, and that overall ecosystem of Agave Utahensis borosmina plants in that area has less of those merged spine genetics for subsequent generations. So there's been a loss of genetic diversity in that specific instance. So when we talk about targeted collection, targeted poaching of Agave Utahensis, that is going out to protected lands and digging up plants that have exceptional characteristics like merged spines or really long spines and selling them into the marketplace. That is a really clear example. Now, that exceptional trait, the genes for that exceptional trait aren't present in the environment, and so fewer of that exceptional trait, or less of that exceptional trait, is going to exist in subsequent generations of the plants out in that habitat. But even large-scale, non-targeted collection, like I was describing before, that commercial size, legal but unethical collection of Agave Utahensis plants can result in a loss of genetic diversity, because every plant that's taken out of the wild is one less potential pollen donor or mother plant that's in that habitat, which will produce a population bottleneck and will reduce the overall genetic diversity. And those plants, Agave Utahensis is probably an obligate outcrosser. That means that it can't self-pollinate, that in order to produce seed, like the seeds that I produce, I pollinate one plant to another plant, right? Generally speaking, most experts believe that Agave Utahensis is not able to self-pollinate. It is an obligate outcrosser. And even if it can self-pollinate, generally the seeds that are produced by self-pollination, that is, if you have one single Agave Utahensis plant and it flowers, and somehow the pollen from that plant manages to fertilize that plant and produce seeds, those seeds are probably going to be less viable. You're not going to get the nearly 100% germination rate that the seeds that I produce generally get. They're going to be lower quantity, and then they're going to be inbred. They're going to have a lower amount of genetic diversity. So it's not only targeted poaching that can damage genetic diversity, it's also just large-scale collection of any Agave Utahensis, clearing out an entire area of all or most of its mature Agave Utahensis individuals is not only reducing the overall number of Agave Utahensis that exist in the world, but it's also severely damaging its genetic diversity. It's reducing the amount of genes in that population. And the loss of genetic diversity can be a real issue. And we'll get into an example of what damage is caused by loss of genetic diversity in other species of agave in a second. But another thing that is important to consider is that, again, Agave Utahensis already has a very fragmented habitat because it lives up in those sky islands, because it can't grow down on the hot desert floor, so it has to live in a really specific band of elevation. And so as climate change happens, which we're already seeing, this summer was the hottest summer on record here in Las Vegas, which is deep in the heart of Agave Utahensis habitat. As climate change happens, habitat fragmentation is becoming much more severe. There's going to be smaller and smaller and smaller pockets and elevation bands that Agave Utahensis can live in, which means that just naturally, without the threat of poaching or wild collection, genetic diversity for the future of Agave Utahensis is going to be much more vulnerable, because as populations shrink and fragment, there's going to be less cross-pollination between genetically different individuals, which will reduce genetic diversity overall. So to explain why genetic diversity loss is a bad thing, we should look to Agave tequilana, blue agave, the agave that's used in Mexico to make tequila, okay? And this also speaks to something that I bring up on my Instagram a decent amount, which is tissue and monoculture. There are a lot of, if you go to any big box store, you'll find right next to the cactuses that have eyeballs and flowers glued onto them and made by the same producers, you're going to find a lot of agave, and a lot of plants in general, but a lot of agave specifically, that have been produced by tissue culture. Every single plant produced in tissue culture is a clone of every other plant produced by that same tissue culture process. So that is monoculture. That is one single genetic individual. There's no genetic diversity in tissue culture. So when you go buy a plant from a big box store that's been produced by tissue culture, which is the vast majority of agaves at big box stores, I would venture to say all agave at big box stores, Home Depot, Lowe's, etc., that is, those operations are not increasing genetic diversity. I don't know that they're yet damaging genetic diversity, but they're certainly not increasing it. But when we look to a plant like agave, tequila agave, that has been produced via monoculture for decades, for generations, there we do see examples of this sort of monoculture, tissue culture, and vegetative propagation does cause loss of genetic diversity, and then that causes problems. So there's two studies actually that I think, there's a number of studies that show this, but I think there's two studies that are particularly insightful. And one of them shows that when you look at the genetic diversity of wild agave plants, like those that are harvested wild, sometimes sustainably, sometimes not, to produce mezcal, you find that their genetic diversity level is 73% higher than tequila agave populations. Now that is to say that industrial tissue culture, monoculture, vegetative propagation, not allowing plants to cross-pollinate, go to seed, and then producing plants from the seed creates a 73% loss of genetic diversity. 73% loss of genetic diversity is a tragic thing because, as other studies show, that loss of genetic diversity carries a reduction of its adaptability to environmental and climate changes and pathogens and pests. Again, as climate change continues to happen, already our habitats are becoming fragmented, but the natural habitats need to rely on that genetic diversity, that biodiversity, to adapt to climate change. If we are genetically bottlenecking populations, either through poaching, overwild collection, or tissue monoculturing, a whole bunch of Agave Utahensis, we're going to end up with an Agave Utahensis overall population that is less adaptable to things like climate change, which are already, and through other mechanisms, endangering them. And then say some new agave pest or pathogen, agave blight or some new bug or whatever that eats Agave Utahensis occurs. If we have only monocultured Agave Utahensis, if the only Agave Utahensis that exists are big box store tissue monocultured Agave Utahensis, all it will take is a single pathogen that can run through the entire population and damage the entire population. So if you are an Agave Utahensis nerd like myself and you care about Agave Utahensis, not only just overall population sizes, but genetic diversity, which will help it to retain population sizes as we go through climate change, then buying seed-grown Agave Utahensis and only seed-growing your own Agave Utahensis is the way to go. And so thank you. I want to hear from you down in the comments. Did I miss anything? Are there other dangers to overwild collection? And what are you doing as an agave consumer to protect Agave Utahensis population sizes and also genetic diversity? Thanks for watching.